Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. With the transfer portal largely winding down, you're starting to get a clearer picture of what these programs are going to look like heading into spring practice, fall camp in the 2024 season. We're taking a deep dive into this Florida Gators offensive line. We're doing it this Thursday. Next Thursday, we got the Florida Gators defensive line, a unit I'm very excited to talk about. But going into this Florida Gators offensive line deep dive, I was a little bit concerned. I thought it might be a little bit of a bloodbath in terms of looking at what this team is losing and then looking at what the film looked like in 2023. And I came away from this being a little bit more optimistic than I thought I would be. I think Billy Napier and the staff did a nice job in the transfer portal. And I think there are some young players that you saw some flashes from in that 2023 year that makes you excited about what this unit can look like in 2024. Now, there are some things that need to improve for this Florida Gators offensive line. That is very clear, but there's also a lot of things to be excited about. Really excited to get into this one. Before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys. This has been truly a blast covering this program over the last couple of weeks in terms of what they've done in the transfer portal, what they've done in the high school recruiting trail. The amount of support you guys show really does mean a lot. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. More importantly, and the best part about doing these kind of things is hearing from you guys, talking ball with y'all, and learning from you guys in the comment section. Would love to hear some names I might be sleeping on, how you think this Florida Gators offensive line looks like in 2024. And without further ado, let's get into this. And I want to start with the broad film notes I had from that 2023 year and then get into what this Florida Gators offensive line will look like from a personnel standpoint in 2024. Now, I think the Florida Gators offensive line got a very bad rep because they had some ugly games. And there's a couple things that they need to work on in a massive way. One, blitz pickup was a problem, and it was a problem all year, whether it was delayed blitzes, whether it was blitzes between the A and B gaps, whether it was pressure off the edge. I mean, the communication wasn't great for this Florida offensive line. I think you had a lot of new faces. You obviously had a new quarterback. You had some young running backs. You're not really sure where to put that blame on because you don't know the pass protection rules for those particular plays. But there were a lot of free runners getting at Graham Mertz pretty consistently. I think Graham Mertz has to do a better job of realizing he's hot, realizing that the defense is sending more than they can pick up and getting the ball out quicker. That's no question about that. But the amount of free runners at the quarterback in terms of picking up blitzes was definitely a problem. The second problem, and I know a lot of Florida Gator fans know this in a meaningful way, and that is Damian George really was just a liability. And you look at the other offensive line play for Florida in 2023, I didn't really think it was as bad as the narrative was. But when you have a liability at tackle pretty consistently throughout that season, that's when it started looking ugly at times. And there were times in there in that Georgia game where Damian George kind of just gets beat clean and gives up an immediate pressure. And then the offensive line in general just kind of starts breaking down. If you can figure out the tackle play, specifically on that right side, I think you feel pretty good about what this Florida offensive line could look like and potentially improve upon in 2024. One other thing in the run game that I kind of noticed was I would like to see Billy Napier and this offensive staff get a little bit more power concepts in this run game. You look at some of the problems Florida had up front. They ran a lot of those stretch zone plays where, one, I don't think that's their personnel. I mean, they have some big bodies coming in. You want to kind of let those guys get downhill. And when you're running those stretch zone concepts where you're asking your offensive linemen to largely kind of go east and west and not get downhill and reestablish the line of scrimmage, it didn't really fit their personnel, and they struggled doing it on a consistent basis. Now, they were able to hit some big plays with those concepts, but far too often they gave up some massive negative plays. And those are kind of drive killing plays, right? When you're running that concept on 1st and 10 and it turns into a 2nd and 12, it gets extremely hard to pick up that first down. And you saw a lot of drive killing plays for this Florida Gators offensive line because I don't really think they were running the football with the concepts that best benefited what this offensive line did. I thought they had a lot more success asking their offensive line to get on some down blocks, pull some guys around, and kind of play a little bit more power concepts in the run game. That's where I saw they had their most success. I'd like to see them do that more in 2024, especially when you look at the personnel and what it's going to look like for Florida on that offensive line in 2024. Now, you start looking at the personnel, you're losing the 3 guys on the inside. right? Kingsley, who I thought was solid. I know he was battling injury. He's going to the NFL. Micah and Richie out in the portal. Solid players. I don't necessarily know if they're going to be massive misses for this Florida team. And quite frankly, there's probably a little bit more of a reason why they're leaving. So you start looking at the personnel. I want to start with the offensive tackle play because that was, probably the toughest part of this Florida offensive line in 2023. And you got to start with Damian George, who I'm excited to see if they kick Damian George to the inside because I think he could be a really good guard. He just was lost at tackle and lost in a really bad way. And what the most frustrating part about doing this deep dive and watching some games of film back and even watching this team in 2023 in real time was they never really addressed it. They just kept trotting out Damian George. I think that kind of spoke to just not enough depth. When you have a tackle that is playing as poor as Damian George, you have to be able to go to somebody else or at least try to fix it. They never really did. And so Damian George just kind of continued to be a massive weak link on this offensive line. You look at Austin Barber at the left tackle spot, and I thought he played pretty solid. This is a guy that had 356 pass per opportunities, only gave up 16 pressures. Austin Barber, I'm kind of excited about whether he sticks at left tackle, maybe moves to right tackle, back to right tackle, I should say. I think you feel like decent about Austin Barber potentially being a starting caliber tackle for Florida in 2024. But I think what you're most excited about is getting two starting caliber guys in the transfer portal. And I want to start with a guy in Devin Manuel, who, if you've listened when we broke down the commitment, I thought this was a massive get. This was a guy that you had a ton of buzz around fall camp last year going into fall camp. He struggles with some injuries. He starts the last 3 games for Arkansas and played really, really good football for Arkansas. I think you might have landed definitely a starting caliber tackle, potentially a very high upside starting tackle at 6'9", 310 pounds. He's got a ton of length. He's a plus athlete for his size. Devin Manuel is probably the most exciting offensive lineman for me heading into 2024. And then you go and get a guy who's just rock solid, and Brandon Crenshaw-Dickson, who's played at San Diego State for multiple years now. Really, really good season in 2023 where he faced 343 pass pros and only gave up 9 pressures. And so I think when you start looking at this Florida Gators offensive line, you have 3 tackles that you feel pretty good about in terms of going into the 2024 season and seeing what you have. And Devin Manuel, Brendan Crenshaw-Dickson, and a guy like Austin Barber. You could throw a guy like Cam Waits in there too. The depth at tackle is in a much better spot than it was in 2023. And I think that tackle play is going to improve. And that was by far the weakest portion of this Florida Gators offensive line. And then you look to the inside, Jake Slaughter arguably played better than Kingsley when he was at center. This was a guy, 328 pass pros, only 9 pressures. Really, really impressed when you saw Jake Slaughter working in at that center spot. I thought he got better as the season went on. And then you start looking at what the inside of this offensive line might look like. You obviously lose Micah and Richie to the transfer portal. Najee Harris is a guy that I think most Florida Gator fans are hoping to see as a starter in 2024. Super high ceiling, very powerful guy. You talk about running those power concepts. You want to run that with a guy like Harris. A guy that can get downhill, reestablish the offensive line, reestablish that line of scrimmage, and give a little bit more space for these running backs to work and work up to linebackers. Really excited about him. And then I'm just going to kind of call the shot now, and I know a lot of Florida Gator fans kind of agree with this as well. Damian George, got to give him a shot at guard. I think he can be a very good guard. I think, 1, he's going to provide some depth on that inside. 2, I think he could be a very solid guard. And so you start looking at this Florida Gators offensive line as a whole, and I think they largely figured out the tackle spot. You have 3 tackles that you feel good about working into competition. If one of those tackles loses that job, you could potentially kick them inside. And then you look at Jake Slaughter, a guy that I think played some really good football for the Florida Gators, a guy like Najee Harris, who I think we're all really excited about what he can be going into 2024. And a guy like Damian George, who, again, I think can provide you really good guard play. You just can't trot him in at tackle. So you start looking at this Florida offensive line in 2024, and there's a couple things that I think you're excited about. 1, I don't think the offensive line play as a whole was as bad as the narrative was. I really thought a lot of those pressures and a lot of the poor performance really came from one sole position group, and that was that tackle spot with Damian George. Thought the other four, like, it wasn't as bad as I think the narrative was. I think, two, you got to clean up the pass pro in terms of picking up blitzes. This is an offensive line that, I mean, Damian George was getting beat, but not a ton of other Florida Gator offensive linemen were just getting beat, missing their one-on-one blocks. It was just some late blitzes from linebackers, some pressure off the edge. They struggled to pick those up. And Graham Mertz, I think, can help this offensive line better by getting the football out quick. And he got better as the season went on. But when you see pressure coming, like, you have to realize you're hot and you have to get the ball out quickly to kind of your checks. And I don't think Graham Mertz did a good enough job of that early on in the season. And then finally, I would like to see this Florida Gators offensive line and Billy Napier and the offensive coaching staff realize, all right, this is what we have on our offensive line. We got some big guys that want to get downhill and reset the line of scrimmage. So quit running those stretch zones where you're asking your big offensive linemen to go east and west. They really struggle with those reach blocks. They let up a lot of penetration. Ask them to do what they're best at. And this is a conversation we have, all the time. As a coaching staff, you have to call your plays and scheme your offense around your personnel. If you have an offensive line that is not athletic enough to run those stretch zone concepts, don't run them that consistently. Ask them to do what they're good at, which is those power concepts where you're getting on the down blocks, pulling guys around, and kind of reestablishing the line of scrimmage. I get the zone run schemes really help in terms of RPOs and that type of stuff. But when you're trying to run the football as consistently as Billy Napier wants to do, you have to run the football according to what your offensive line can block up. And I think that's going to be some more of those power concepts. I'm not saying this Florida Gators offensive line is going to be the best unit in the SEC. I do think it's going to be a better unit. And I quite frankly didn't think it was as bad as many, I don't know if Florida Gator fans are saying this, but the national media was saying in 2023. So I'm excited about this group. Really excited to see Damian George potentially working as guard. Very excited to read the spring practice notes. Look how this offensive line is shaping up. Obviously, we'll continue to talk about this group during the duration of the offseason. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. Would love to hear from you guys in the comment section in terms of how you're feeling about this offensive line, whether I left out some players that you thought I should be mentioning as potential starting candidates. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.